We are joined by former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama, current co-host of Pod Save the World, and someone who has been subjected to so many right-wing bullshit attacks, you'd think he was a Muslim woman. Ben Rhodes, thank you for being here. I want to start by asking you about the ceasefire, which is obviously welcome. But I wanted to ask you, because you were in the White House the last time there was a ceasefire, and that was after weeks of violence by Hamas directed at Israeli civilians and by Israeli defense forces inside of Gaza. What happened after the last ceasefire? What did it look like after it took effect?
Well, the same thing that happened after the two ceasefires in 2009, the ceasefires in 2012, things got worse. And that's actually why I think we need to be cautious. I welcome the ceasefire in terms of the fact that obviously it's going to save people's lives, that there's not active military operations. But basically, if you look at 2014 to 2021, what's happened since then with respect to the Palestinian circumstance? Prime Minister Netanyahu used to say he was for a two-state solution, now says he will never allow it to happen on his watch. The settlements continue to expand significantly, including into areas where Palestinians actually lived and have been displaced. The humanitarian situation in Gaza continued to get worse, and then Trump obviously came in and basically gave Netanyahu every single thing he wanted on this issue, and it led to the kind of extreme hopelessness that was so present throughout this last Gaza conflict. What was different this time is there's no peace process. There's no talk of a two-state solution. There's no sense that there's any hope, not just for people in Gaza, but for Palestinians and Arabs in Israel itself, and obviously in the West Bank. So I always feel like when I come on Love It or Leave It, I'm like the downer, because that's usually what attracts foreign policy attention. But but I think people need to have eyes wide open that the ceasefire helps save lives, but it doesn't solve the problem.
So what is... I remember actually at the White House, I remember you saying this to me. You were frustrated because there had been another round of criticism of the Obama administration for not being pro-Israel enough for one reason or another. I don't remember the exact circumstances. But I remember you saying really defiantly and really in a really frustrated way, like, we are, like, if you believe in Israel's right to exist, that means you believe in a two-state solution. And if you believe in two-state solution, the only way forward is to stop some of these settlements, is to stop some of the ways in which Israel is undermining the prospects of a peace process. Now here we are. It's a decade later almost, and Benjamin Netanyahu has abandoned a two-state solution, and now there are more people advocating for a one-state solution. The Kerry plan is still out there. You talked about this with Tommy and Pod Save the World. That is the last democratic plan that exists for a path to a two-state solution, or an opening bid towards a two-state solution. Where is your head at on that debate right now? What do you think of these arguments being made for a one-state solution versus a two-state solution?
So, I mean, I think we have to step back and be honest about where the situation is and where it's going, because I get get attacked by all manner of people, who don't like what I say about this issue. But then I think sincerely some people that will point out that, the Palestinians didn't take the deal at Camp David, which was now over 20 years ago. But the reality is, how could this end? It could end in a two-state solution, and everybody knows what that looks like. And the Kerry plan identifies it, and you have to give the Palestinians enough that they actually have a state, and that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem have a capital there. That's one way this could go. The other way it could go is where it feels like it's going, which is that Israel wants to have control over all the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. So basically the entire West Bank, and that over time, through attrition, through 5, 10, 20 years, the Palestinians just have to submit to that or leave. And then the other way is to say, we're for one state in which Palestinians have equal rights with Israelis. There's not another way this can go. What I always say to people who are, kind of get critical of me for being critical of the Israeli government is, what is your solution to dealing with the Palestinians? Like, they live there. There are millions of them. They are human beings that live in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem, and some in Israel. Like, some in refugee camps. Like, what is your, and there's never an answer, right? And the Israeli government has actually now become more open in its aspiration for a greater Israel, for basically controlling all the land. And so where's my head on this? My head is like, I'm still a two-state solution guy, because like that seems like the best, outcome to this whole thing. I have to wrestle with and acknowledge the reality that sounds meaningless. What does that mean to a Palestinian kid? Just an American talking about two-state solution when their lived reality is something that is making that impossible. Then I see the logic of people who say, let's have a one-state solution in which everybody has equal rights. That too seems like it could be, a just outcome. Jon, like, we have trouble enough living with Republicans in this country, like envisioning, a reality in which Israelis and Palestinians kind of all live peacefully and prosperously together. It's just hard. I mean, it's just hard to see that happening. And so I think we're stuck where we are,
Yeah, you talked about this with Tommy a bit, how unsustainable this all is. And yet it has been
sustained
for decades. It has gotten worse. And do you know what a shepherd tone is? Have you heard of a shepherd tone? It's an audio illusion it's a scale that sounds like it's rising forever, but never actually rises. It just is perpetually getting more and more and more elevated. You mentioned that that Benjamin Netanyahu has now said no two-state solution on his watch. He obviously doesn't believe in a state in which there are more Palestinians than Jews in a democracy, right? He does not believe in that, right? Yeah. So what does is that simply acknowledging that what he wants is a permanent situation in which the Palestinians are non-citizens in Gaza and the West Bank, and second-class citizens inside of Israel?
I don't know how you look at that and calculate and conclude anything differently, because the situation is essentially the occupation is permanent, and the Israeli settlements are just eating away at the land where the Palestinians live, and life is being made so miserable for Palestinians in certain places that they're either forced to leave or maybe they choose to leave. I mean, that's the logic of what is happening with the Israeli government's policies. And we don't if you don't think that's right, you don't do Israel any favors by saying you won't criticize it over that, or you won't question whether the U.S. should continue to provide almost $4 billion a year in assistance to a government that is doing that, And so I think the question is, what can change that? Obviously, the biggest thing is if there's a shift in Israeli politics. That the challenge is that Israel's been moving more to the right in its politics. And so one of the only other things that can change that, I think, is the United States. And I think that Americans, and particularly American Jews, I was listening to you on Pod Save America, kind of feel this intuitively, right? Because you want Israel to succeed. You want it to be both a safe haven for the Jewish people and a just place. But how can you ignore where this is all going?
And I really appreciate that, I was really trying to be honest about it and say, look, as a Jewish person, I do see Israel as a refuge for a persecuted group of people that they almost wiped Jews off the planet, and that continued after the Holocaust. And when I said that I was a Zionist, I think there were a lot of people who just said they stopped listening after that. And I wish they hadn't, right? I wish they had continued listening, because what I said is that I don't, as someone who believes in Israel, I don't understand how you can believe in Israel without also recognizing that Israel is never going to be safe and free and sustainable if the Palestinian people are subjected to indiscriminate killing, are not free, are not able to build a life, or not able to build a country, that is not sustainable. And I do think it's important that we talk about that.
I think that the reaction you might have gotten to that too. What's interesting to me about that is, Jon, like you, I grew up in a household with a Jewish mother who, Zionism was not inconsistent with kind of secular socialism, like the kibbutz, like the Israel. And I think what people have to recognize is, you and I grew up at a time when it was still in kind of recent memory that Israel was like this underdog, fighting off its neighbors, claiming its capacity to live as a free and independent state, but rooted in some pretty left-wing values, equal rights for all of its citizens. And what you've had over the particularly kind of turbocharged since Rabin's assassination, not to kind of get too into history here, is just this kind of steady march to the right in Israel for a lot of reasons. Some of them demographic, some of them political, some of them tied to the global trend of the rise of kind of ethno-nationalism. Bibi's been at the vanguard of all those trends. And what I keep coming back to is not only do I worry about like how secure could Israel be if it doesn't address this, but what kind of world is it in which ethno-nationalism is on the march? That ends up usually being a really dangerous world for Jewish people, like it always comes back. And we see this even now, right? Like the rise of anti-Semitism from all directions in some extent. And so I don't know. I wish people, sometimes there's a formula to how people talk about this and the two-state solution and the final status issues. And if you've ever read a speech about this, there's a whole language of the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Maybe it's just time to throw that language out and just consider the experience of a Palestinian child who has no freedom of movement in Gaza, who has no running water for most of the day, who has no electricity, who has no political leadership to speak of. They have Hamas, who I'm sure they don't have much love for, and don't even belong to a nation. It's not right. Jewish ethics, Jewish traditions, like Jewish experience, like should tell you that's not right. And people need. It can seem hopeless, but if you give into that, you'll never fix it. Ultimately, what has to happen is a shift inside of Israel. But I think America is deluding itself if we act like we have no agency here, to try to affect that. And
there is this metaphor inside of Israeli politics right now, which is one of the reasons Benjamin Netanyahu saw some political benefit in this conflict is that he is unable to form a government. Yeah. But the opposition is also unable to form a government. It is a moment which right-wing politics is not being fully embraced as the answer, but there doesn't seem to also be a coalition, an alternative coming together to offer something different. And I think that's true in both in terms of what we're seeing in Israel, but also in our own language, in our own conversation. I feel the same way. I'm not an expert in this. I look to you. I look to others for the language of how to talk about this, how to advocate for the rights and lives of Palestinian people while believing in the project of Israel.
Put it this way, Jon, one quick way I put it is like one mentality might say that because of the experience of the Jewish people throughout history, Israel deserves exceptions. Israel deserves to be able to do certain things that we probably wouldn't agree with if other governments are doing it. I think that ultimately is a dangerous world for the Jewish people, not just because of the state of Israel, because the more just and peaceful the world is generally, the less things like anti-Semitism take root. I just worry about where this is going without a course correction.
Look, sometimes we want to find a way out of these conversations that leaves people feeling hopeful, but it's a hard situation.
What's hopeful is that young people. You even mentioned that Bibi's tried 4 times now, 4 elections, and he couldn't form a government. Like the Israeli people are ambivalent about something, like there's they and you talk to Israelis, they will. Through their own trauma, tell you about terrorism and Hamas rockets, in very persuasive ways, but then they know this doesn't feel right. I mean, not all of them. Some are very right wing, and we should add, just like in America, people I really don't agree with here.
And often, by the way, the debate inside of Israel on the question of Israel has been more fulsome and wider than the one that we have in the United States.
It's much more open. I mean, you saw much more commentary in Israel this last round. This whole Gaza war was just about Bibi's politics. If you said that here, that would kind of get, pushed out of the debate. And what's hopeful is younger people being like, we're sick of this. And what's hopeful is connecting all the different movements that are happening around the world for social justice, racial justice, equality, that should all become one. What's hopeful was that the Palestinians had a non-violent, the most notable thing that happened to me on the Palestinian side during the last couple of weeks was a non-violent general strike. Non-violence is a hopeful thing. I hope, it doesn't guarantee it's going to bring about change. So if there's hope, it's that people, even though it's so hard. I mean, I admire so many people like who've spoken up here, including, you see these young Jewish voices who it's painful to speak out. But there's something hopeful about people who care enough to say, this doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah, and I do think it was striking that the leadership of Hamas declared victory. Benny Gantz, who is the Israeli defense minister, declared victory. But I think there is not a person watching this conflict that thinks anybody won anything.
No, nobody won anything. That's kind of, except Bibi, who probably, won himself at least another election,
Ben Rhodes, thank you so much. Everybody should pre-order Ben's book. It's called After the Fall. It has a subtitle, but you don't need that to Google it. Just Google After the Fall, Ben Rhodes, put in a pre-order.
Big reveal here. Ronan Farrow makes a cameo in the book.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, describing when, speaking of Israel, Black Cube was spying on me. So overlapping circles of that experience.
Oh, interesting.
And then, I obviously want people to read the book for substantive reasons, but also because Bill O'Reilly, one of his killing books is at the top.
No, who'd he kill now?
I can't even remember who he killed at this point. He killed somebody else.
What a factory he made. Ben, thank you so much.